I'm Bryson Bort, and this is Hack the Plant. For today's episode, I'm joined by a colleague of mine at the R Street Institute, Beth Garza, who is a senior fellow with the Energy and Environmental Policy team. Over the course of her 35-year career in the electric utility industry, Beth has held a variety of leadership roles in generation and transmission planning, system operations, regulatory affairs, and market design for both regulated and competitive entities. Her previous employers include Nextera and Austin Energy. Prior to joining the R Street Institute, Beth served as the director of the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, who you may better know as ERCOT. This gives her a unique perspective on the power outage that crippled the state of Texas back in February. 3 severe winter storms and an electricity generation failure left almost 5 million without power and gave rise to shortages of heat, food, and water. Beth, who lives in Texas, of course, shares her experience and explains how this infrastructure failure happened.
The cause, the proximate cause, it was weather. It was pervasive, widespread, very cold weather. And for listeners who may live in New England or Montana, they would laugh at what we in Texas would call cold weather. But the fact of the matter is that here in Austin, we set a record that week for the number of hours below freezing. And that record was 168 hours. So we were a full week of freezing weather, not rising above freezing, which is very, very unusual. So what happened? Lots of power plants became unavailable in rapid succession, likely due to a combination of cold weather and freezing components at the power plants.
The massive power failure was a cascade of events within ERCOT, who manages the flow of electric power to more than 26 million Texas residents, representing about 90% of the state's electric load. As an independent system operator for the region, ERCOT schedules power on an electric grid that connects more than 46,000 miles of transmission lines and over 700 generation units.
All types of generation that are part of the ERCOT mix suffered or were not, none of them were at full capacity. All types of generation suffered some sort of outage due to the weather. And so what happened is that in the very early morning, just after midnight on Monday morning, in a world where demand has to equal supply all the time, and it has to meet exactly, the situation was that demand was exceeding the diminished supply. As power plants were tripping offline, there just was not enough supply to meet customer demand. Recognizing how critical it is, and electricity is one of those things that it's very easy to take for granted, right? Every day we just, we wake up in the morning, you turn the light on, you turn your computer on, it just works. It's, that's just life as we know it right now. Until you live without it in your same house for a period of time. And then you recognize how pervasive it is as just the way of life in society right now. And the disruption that can come from not having electricity highlights how important it is to do everything we can to continue to have it.
Security has been in the news a lot lately, but there are a lot of challenges to actually doing it. One of them is that a lot of these asset owners, the utilities themselves, are limited by rate-based infrastructure. Can you talk about that and some of those challenges?
So one of the differences in ERCOT, in the ERCOT structure, is that the bulk of the system is not limited by rate base or structures. They are even more limited based on competitive forces. So power plants and retail providers, those entities actually billing individual customers and receiving money from individual customers none of those entities have a guaranteed rate of return or a guarantee of revenues of any sort. They are competing against others of similar type. And so if you want a power plant to, a generator to implement appropriate cybersecurity safeguards in ERCOT, those have to be mandated. That has to be structured such that if you want to operate in ERCOT, here's what you have to do. And the costs of doing so have to be such that that generator owner can recover them as part of their competitive supply. And that's easier to do if every generator is having to do the same thing, right? If every generator has to do the same thing, then just the overall cost across the board is increased. And, you're not creating a differentiated response, which could preference one asset owner versus another. So that on the generation side, similarly on the competitive retail side. And then on the wires, the transmission and distribution companies, they are regulated. And in my pretty blasé view of regulation is regulated entities will do whatever regulators tell them to do and whatever they're allowed to recover their costs of. And so that's a much more, from my perspective, a much more straightforward mechanism for regulation is a much more straightforward mechanism for ensuring whatever requirements or standards it's decided needed to be imposed are actually imposed and implemented.
How does ERCOT work? What does this power outage suggest about the resilience of our critical infrastructure? Join us for an in-depth discussion. Thank you for listening to Hack the Plant, a podcast of the R Street Institute and ICS Village nonprofit. Subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends. Even better, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts so we can reach even more listeners. Tell us what you thought about it and who we should interview next by finding us on Twitter at RSI or at ICS_Village. Finally, if you want to know more about R Street or ICS Village, visit rstreet.org or icsvillage.com. I'm your host, Bryson Borg. Thank you to executive producer Tyler Lowe of Fader Creative, creative producer William Gray, and editor Dominic Sterrett of Sterrett Production.